Hi there, I'm John McAdams, founder of the Big Game Hunting blog. And in this video, I'm going to do a detailed analysis of popular shotgun gauges, their naming conventions, and what they're best suited for. While many hunters know a little bit about shotgun gauges, I think that most people would likely agree that the subject can be really confusing. That is perfectly understandable because the way shotgun gauges are classified is counterintuitive at first glance. It's also based on an old, outdated measuring system that has gradually evolved over the years. The end result is something of a convoluted mess that the average hunter can really struggle to make heads or tails out of. Not surprisingly, there are even more misunderstandings and misconceptions regarding shotgun gauges than most other subjects concerning firearms and ammunition. For that reason, I'm going to discuss the ins and outs of shotgun gauges in detail in this episode. I'll go over the history of shotshells, how they got their naming convention, compare and contrast some of the more popular shotgun gauges, for instance the 12 versus 20 gauge in particular, and provide some recommendations on the best uses for each. So first, we'll start with a history of shotgun naming conventions.
To really understand shotgun gauges, we need to head back to the days of black powder. Back then, cannons were named in accordance with the mass of the projectile they shot, not by their bore diameter. For instance, a 12-pound cannon, also known as a 12-pounder, shot a round ball that weighed approximately 12 pounds. The same principle applied to 8-pounders, 6-pounders, 4-pounders, etc. Shoulder-fired weapons that fire projectiles weighing less than 1 pound use a closely related system. Continuing down that same line of thought from 12 to 8 to 4-pound projectiles, the naming convention switches from pounds to bore when we drop below 1 pound of lead. Large bore black powder rifles were named in this manner, and this is also where the system for measuring shotgun gauges comes from. For example, a 2-bore rifle has a nominal bore diameter equal to the diameter of a lead ball weighing 1/2 pound. A 4-bore rifle has a bore diameter of a 1/4 pound lead sphere, etc. So we have a system where a 10-gauge shotgun has a bore diameter the same size as a 1/10 pound ball of lead, and the diameter of the barrel on a 12-gauge shotgun is the size of a 1/12 pound lead ball. Now obviously, if they're made out of the same material, a 12-pound round ball will be larger in diameter than an 8-pound round ball. This is also true with a 10-gauge or a 10-bore ball compared to a 12-gauge round ball. In short, the smaller the number gauge of a shotgun, the larger the bore diameter. This is why a 10-gauge shotgun has a larger bore diameter than a 12-gauge shotgun, which has a larger bore diameter than a 20-gauge shotgun, etc. A different way of saying the same thing would be to describe shotgun gauges in terms of the number of lead balls of a certain diameter necessary to weigh 1 pound. So, 12 round balls of 12-gauge diameter would weigh 1 pound. But since they're smaller, it would take 20 balls of 20-gauge diameter to weigh a pound. There is one exception to this rule, the 410 bore. Sometimes inaccurately described as a 410 gauge or a 36 gauge, it's the only shotgun in common use that is named after its actual bore size, 0.410 inches in diameter, as opposed to its gauge number. If it were named like all the other popular shotgun bores, it would be approximately 67 gauge. Fortunately, it's no longer required to actually do the calculations necessary to determine the internal diameter of the barrel for most popular shotgun bores. The nominal bore size of a 10 gauge is 0.775 inches, 0.729 inches for a 12 gauge, 0.663 inches for a 16 gauge, 0.615 inches for 20 gauge, 0.55 inches for 28 gauge, and 0.410 inches for a 410 bore. Now remember, gauge size only describes the bore diameter of a shotgun. While that is extremely important, there are many other characteristics of shotgun shells to keep in mind as well. In addition to gauge, shotgun shells also come in varying lengths with different loads of powder, shot weight, shot size, and shot composition. For example, I have a box of shotgun shells here and I'll describe the markings on it to you and go over what everything means. This box contains 20 gauge shells designated for use in a 2 3/4 inch chamber. The individual shells are loaded with a 2.5 dram equivalent of powder and 7/8 of an ounce of 7.5 size shot. Winchester markets this particular ammunition for upland bird hunting, sporting clays, skeet, and trap. Let's break down what each of these things means. The spot where it says 2 3/4 inches references the length of one of the shells after it has been fired. They're usually about ½ inch shorter when loaded. Longer shells usually contain some combination of more shot and or more powder for a higher velocity and or a heavier shot load. We'll talk more about the pros and cons of all this stuff in a minute. The following shell lengths and gauges are standardized by SAAMI and are the most widely available and easy to find. 3.5 inch 10 gauge, 2 3/4 inch, 3 inch, and 3.5 inch 12 gauge, 2 3/4 inch 16 gauge, 2 3/4 inch and 3 inch for 20 gauge, 2 3/4 inch for 28 gauge, and 2.5 and 3 inch for 410 bore. Now, sizes other than those I just listed are sometimes available in limited numbers. Look on the barrel or the chamber of your shotgun to determine the proper length shell it can use. A shotgun with a longer chamber can generally safely use smaller shells, but the opposite is not true. For example, 20 gauge shells are commonly available in both 2 3/4 inch and 3 inch lengths. So in this case, you could safely fire those 2 3/4 inch shells in a 20 gauge shotgun with either a 2 3/4 inch or a 3 inch chamber. On the other hand, a shotgun with a 2 3/4 inch chamber could only fire 2 3/4 inch shells. Aside from slugs, shotgun shells are loaded with a large number of pellets. The exact number of pellets depends on their size and composition, as well as the total weight of pellets loaded into the shell. To determine the size of birdshot, just subtract the shot size from 0.17 inches. So in this case of 7.5 birdshot, it is 0.095 inches in diameter. And we get that by taking 0.17 minus 0.075 to get 0.095. This is not the case with other types of shot like BB and buckshot. But while there are exceptions, those other shot sizes larger than 0.17 inches generally increase in size in a pretty uniform manner as well. Some boxes of shotgun shells state the composition of the pellets. For instance, lead-free, non-toxic shot is mandated for waterfowl hunting in North America. So shells marketed for waterfowl hunters will state they contain pellets made of bismuth, tungsten, steel, or some other kind of alloy that doesn't contain lead. Additionally, some upland and turkey hunting loads intended for use on larger birds will sometimes use copper-plated shot that's less likely to deform on impact. Most shotgun shells are loaded with lead shot, and it's best to assume that's what you're dealing with if the box doesn't say anything about it one way or another. Of all the materials commonly used to produce shot, lead is the most dense. This means that a given number of individual lead pellets will weigh more than the same number of pellets of the same diameter made out of some other material. And we'll talk more on this later too. So with all of those things in mind, we can determine that the box of 20 gauge shells we've been talking about contains lead pellets that are 0.095 inches in diameter. Now we get to the 2 1/2 dram equivalent part. This area can get particularly confusing, so bear with me a minute here. A dram is a unit of mass from the old British weight system that still remains in varying degrees of use in some of the former colonies. Back in the days of black powder, drams were commonly used to measure the amount of black powder in a particular load. Most people know that there are 16 ounces in a pound. Well, there's 16 drams in an ounce, so therefore there are 256 drams in a pound. Additionally, many gun enthusiasts know that there are 7,000 grains in a pound. This means that there are 27.34 grains in a dram. So, a 2 1/2 dram load of black powder would weigh 68.35 grains. A long time ago, somebody somewhere determined that a certain 12 gauge shotgun load firing 1 1/8 ounces of shot with 3 drams of black powder, or 82 grains of black powder, had a muzzle velocity of 1,200 feet per second. If that sounds like a cumbersome way of doing things, you're right. It's really confusing, but ever since then, companies manufactured shotgun shells listing the powder in terms of drams of black powder. After the transition to smokeless powder in the early 20th century, ammunition companies continued to describe the amount of powder they loaded in a shotgun shell in dram equivalents. It's an imprecise way of doing things, but what they were trying to do in a roundabout way was describe the velocity of that particular load. Dram equivalents are good for making an apples-to-apples comparison. So all other things equal, a 2 3/4 dram equivalent load will have a higher velocity than a 2 1/2 dram equivalent load. But that's about it, and it's completely meaningless if it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. For that reason, companies are making the transition away from listing dram equivalents on shotgun shells, and instead are publishing the actual velocity of the load. You'll still occasionally run into boxes still bearing dram equivalent markings, but they're getting less and less common. Now let's be clear here. Dram equivalents should only be used as a general comparison between two different shotgun loads. Furthermore, smokeless powder is considerably more powerful than black powder, and you should never reload shotgun shells using drams or dram equivalents of smokeless powder. Only reload shells in accordance with the data supplied by a good reloading manual. Doing anything else can be very dangerous. Okay, now let's talk about the recommended uses for the various different bore sizes. Of all the shotguns in the United States, 12-gauge guns are by far the most popular. 20-gauge comes in second, followed by the 28-gauge and the 410 bore. The 10-gauge and the 16-gauge are much less common than the rest, but they're by no means rare. So which one is best for you? Well, it depends. The shot pattern of a shotgun gradually expands as range increases. This makes it easier to hit a target, especially one that's moving out to a certain range. Hunters can tighten up the shot spread to a certain extent by using a choke, which is a constriction on the muzzle of the shotgun. However, there always eventually comes a point where the shot pattern is too spread out to guarantee a hit on an object that passes through the shot column. Additionally, the individual pellets all slow down as they leave the barrel. In general, heavier pellets retain more velocity at longer range and cause more damage than smaller and lighter pellets. However, increasing the size of shot results in fewer individual pellets. So increasing the shot size comes at the expense of a thinner shot pattern if the total shot weight remains the same. Shot patterns are traditionally measured by shooting at the center of a 30-inch circle at 40 yards and counting the number of pellets that hit inside the circle. A dense pattern is ideal for quickly and ethically taking game, and it means that more pellets hit inside that circle and there aren't any large voids within it. Certain shotguns pattern better with particular loads. That being said, in general, one way to get a dense shot pattern is to increase the shot weight, like going from 1 ounce to 1 1/8 ounces of shot, for example. However, shot weight can only be increased to a certain degree for a particular gauge and shell length. This is further complicated for North American waterfowl hunters when using steel shot. Remember when we talked about how lead is more dense than steel earlier in the article? This is why that matters. Since individual steel pellets weigh less than lead pellets of the same size, hunters must typically use larger diameter steel shot or suffer degraded terminal performance. However, using larger diameter shot results in thinner shot patterns. This is why many duck and goose hunters use 10-gauge and 12-gauge 3-inch or 3.5-inch Magnum shotguns, which can fire a heavier load of shot. All other things being equal, a larger bore shotgun with a heavier load of shot will throw more pellets and therefore produce a denser shot pattern at a given range than a smaller bore shotgun with a lighter load of shot. Hunting larger game animals like turkey and goose usually requires heavier loads of larger sized shot. The same goes for taking longer range shots. However, there is such a thing as overkill though, and hitting a small creature with a heavy load of shot will cause substantial damage, resulting in the loss of much or all the meat. At the same time, the heavier load fired from the larger bore shotgun comes at the price of more recoil. As you can probably imagine, there's something of a sweet spot when it comes to shot size and weight for a certain game. The skill level of the hunter also plays into the equation. Robert Rourke summed this up pretty well in his essay, The Brave Quail. And I quote, "The gauge of the gun is the index of the ability of the man to prove his manhood. If it is a 12 gauge, he's so-so. If it's a 16, he's pretty good. If it's a 20 gauge, he is excellent. And if it's a 410, he is bragging." So with all that being said, here are the recommended uses for each of the most popular shotgun gauges. The 10 gauge is the largest bore size that you'll typically find hunters using these days. It's primarily used by waterfowl hunters, especially for goose hunting. This is because of the previously discussed advantages of the larger bore and longer shell length offered by the 10 gauge when using non-toxic shot compared to all other shotgun gauges in common use. Its stout recoil, coupled with the heavy weight of most 10-gauge shotguns, also limits the appeal of that bore size to most hunters. While there are a few turkey loads currently offered in 10-gauge using number 4, number 5, and number 6 size shot, non-toxic ammo intended for use on ducks, size 2, or geese, BB, BBB, or size T shot, makes up the vast majority of all 10-gauge ammunition currently manufactured. Now let's talk about the 12-gauge. 12 gauge is by far the most popular shotgun size in the United States and possibly the entire world. Produced in just about every type of shotgun, from semi-automatics to pump actions and everything in between, the 12 gauge is the shotgun of choice for many big game, turkey, waterfowl, upland, and small game hunters. It's also the number one choice for home defense as well as for military and law enforcement use. Indeed, a hunter armed with an inexpensive Remington 870 or Mossberg 500 pump-action shotgun could conceivably hunt almost every species of game in North America by simply changing the barrel, choke, and/or shot size as necessary. Not surprisingly, 12-gauge ammunition is also widely available in virtually every shot size from number 9 all the way up to triple-aught buck and slugs. Standard 2 3/4-inch 12-gauge shells work very well on most species of small and upland game. They'll also do the trick for waterfowl, turkey, and big game, but the larger 3-inch Magnum shells are more popular for hunting those species. The 3.5-inch 12-gauge shells are best suited for waterfowl hunting, particularly for geese. The 12-gauge is so popular because it's powerful enough to hunt most species of game, but the recoil of the 12-gauge is much more manageable than the 10-gauge. A 12-gauge shell also has an advantage over the smaller gauges because it has a shorter shot column. Basically, the fatter 12-gauge shell can fit the same weight of shot into a shorter column, which results in less shot deformation as it travels down the barrel. This means that 12-gauge loads will generally pattern better with the same amount of shot when compared to a smaller gauge shotgun. All right, now let's talk about the 16-gauge. While it remains relatively popular in Europe, the 16-gauge never really caught on with American hunters. Most American hunters looking for an all-purpose shotgun use a 12-gauge, and those looking for something lighter tend to use the 20-gauge. Several factors contributed to this state of affairs, but the transition to steel shot for waterfowl in particular really hurt usage of the 16-gauge, and now it's one of the least commonly used shotgun sizes used in North America. Now that being said, the 16-gauge can do just about everything else almost as good as the 12-gauge, but with a little bit less recoil. While it's certainly a capable all-around shotgun gauge suitable for deer, turkey, and duck hunting, the 16-gauge is most often used in the United States for small and upland game like pheasant, quail, dove, grouse, rabbit, and squirrel. For this reason, most 16-gauge shells are loaded with number 4, 5, 6, 7.5, and number 8 size shot. All right, let's talk about the 20-gauge now. Ranking only behind the 12-gauge in terms of popularity, the 20-gauge is by far the most widely used of all the smaller gauges. It's available in a wide variety of shotgun types, primarily pump and semi-auto though, and 20-gauge loads are manufactured in just about every size from number 9 all the way up to number 2 buckshot and slugs. While the 20-gauge is on the light side for deer, turkey, and waterfowl hunting, it will work in a pinch for those situations. Indeed, advances in non-toxic shotgun ammunition over the past few decades have dramatically improved the suitability of the 20-gauge for waterfowl hunting. However, the 20-gauge is widely used as an upland and small game shotgun, and it excels in those roles. The light recoil of the 20-gauge, coupled with the fact that it has a much denser shot pattern than the 410 bore, helps explain why the 20-gauge is so popular among small-framed as well as younger shooters and hunters. The relatively low felt recoil of the 20-gauge also makes it well suited for self-defense and makes it easier to take a rapid follow-up shot. As a slight aside, one final thing to keep in mind about 20-gauge shotgun shells is that, regardless of the manufacturer, current production 20-gauge shells are always yellow. Why are 20-gauge shells yellow? Well, 12 and 20-gauge are by far the most commonly used shotgun gauges. For this reason, they are also the most likely to get mixed up. 20-gauge shells are also considerably smaller than 12-gauge shells. A 12-gauge shell won't fit in a 20-gauge chamber because it's too big. On the other hand, if you attempt to load a 20-gauge shell in a 12-gauge shotgun, the shell is the perfect size for a bad situation. It's small enough to drop through the chamber and big enough to get stuck just far enough down the barrel for another shell to load and potentially fire behind it. This will obviously have catastrophic results if the shotgun is subsequently fired without removing the obstruction. You should never attempt to load any shells of a different gauge into any shotgun, but this is of particular importance with 20-gauge shells. In addition to the fact that 20-gauge shells are so common, they're also just the perfect size to cause that especially dangerous situation. A 16-gauge shell is big enough that it won't go far enough down the barrel of a 12-gauge shotgun for another 12-gauge shell to chamber and fire behind it. On the other hand, 28-gauge and 410 bore shells are small enough that they'll just travel all the way through a 12-gauge barrel without getting stuck. So, 20 gauge shells are yellow in order to make them easy to identify and to minimize the chances of loading a 20 gauge shell in a 12 gauge shotgun. Okay, let's get back to discussing the other shotgun bore sizes. Ranking below the 12 and 20 gauges in terms of popularity, the 28 gauge shotgun is somewhat common in upland game hunting and skeet shooting circles. It's substantially more powerful than the 410 bore, but still has a very gentle recoil even in a lighter gun. The 28 gauge is commonly available in a number of lightweight and easy to carry shotguns. Ammo is far from common, but it's not rare either. Almost all 28 gauge ammo options are concentrated in the smaller 6, 7.5, 8, and 9 shot sizes, ideal for skeet shooting, as well as squirrel, rabbit, dove, grouse, and quail hunting. Do you remember when Vice President Dick Cheney accidentally shot his hunting partner back in 2006? Well, they were quail hunting down in South Texas, and Vice President Cheney was using a Perazzi 28 gauge shotgun. So that's an interesting piece of trivia for you. And now we'll finish up with the 410 bore. As the smallest shotgun bore in common use, the 410 is most often used for small game hunting. The 410 does have a very mild recoil, which makes it popular for smaller framed hunters like children. The very first gun I ever carried hunting was a break-action, single-shot 410 shotgun, and I used it as a kid for a season or two pursuing squirrels in East Texas before graduating to a 20 gauge. 410 ammunition and shotguns are pretty common and easy to find as well. While the 410 is available in most shot sizes, its light payload and correspondingly thinner pattern can make the 410 a challenging shotgun to hunt with at anything other than short range. For that reason, the 410 is most commonly used by brand new hunters, like me, expert clay shooters, or well-seasoned hunters looking for a challenge like Rourke described in his quail hunting quote I read you earlier. That being said, the small size and extremely light recoil of the 410 make it popular for run-of-the-mill varmint and pest control in single-shot shotguns. It's also found in niche combination and/or survival guns like the M6 Aircrew survival weapon, which had 2 barrels, one in 22 Hornet and the other in 410 bore. Now, with all that being said, if you're looking for the most versatile shotgun possible, then the choice is clear. Get a high-quality 12-gauge shotgun, preferably one with a 3-inch chamber that can accommodate both 2 3/4-inch and 3-inch shells. If you're a little bit more sensitive to recoil, then get a 20-gauge shotgun, which has a marked recoil advantage over the 12-gauge. All of the other shotgun bore sizes certainly have their place for specific tasks, like goose hunting for the 10-gauge or small bore skeet shooting for the 28-gauge, but none can hold the candle to the versatility of the 12 and 20-gauge shotguns.
If you enjoyed this video, then please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel right now. Just click that red subscribe button below to make sure you don't miss out on any of my new videos about hunting gear reviews, cartridge comparisons, and more. For more detailed information on popular hunting cartridges and shotgun gauges and what they are best suited for, click on the link in the description below or go to huntingguns101.com to get a free ebook I have written on the best hunting calibers. Now I'm going to turn it over to you guys. What shotgun gauge do you prefer? What game have you successfully taken with them? And what ammo do you like to use to hunt with? Let me know by leaving a comment on this video right now. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and good hunting.